So the real question here is, why bother with the 250th anniversary of anything? I mean, too old to remember, too old to care. And here we are at the 250th anniversary of the founding of America, the Declaration of Independence.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Welcome to the public square.
But it started earlier than that. The people in Massachusetts got the jump start. I mean, you know, the Patriots and the Red Sox fans are ahead of the game again, and they've decided to start in commemorating events that happened in 1775, beginning with the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Jeff Sanders, do you remember telling or saying that poem, reciting that poem, or reading it in school?
Yes, it was required reading in the fourth grade. And we had to memorize portions of it, which
no kidding.
I can't remember much of it anymore, except it's the 18th of April in 75.
And you shall hear of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere.
It was the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive, something like that. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow composed that poem.
Isn't that funny? It's kind of, a lot of people, that's the only poem they know of Longfellow. You know, he had other poems, too,
right.
You know. So it's just, if you like that one, maybe I've got a collection of his. I need to read more of them, but yeah, he did do more.
So, Alan, do you remember the Paul Revere poem in school?
I remember it. I don't remember if it was school or just something that I learned growing up in my family. I can't remember the exact provenance of me hearing that, but it could have been school.
One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore shall be. I know you heard that part.
And now here's the key, though, Jeff. If we did a man on the street interview and ask, was it one or two lanterns that hung in the church steeple? I wonder how good people would do on that one.
Pretty sure it was one, because the British went by land, sure right?
No, they started by sea.
Oh, that's right. That's right. They went across the harbor. Right.
There you go. Yeah, they started by sea too. Well, you know what?
I'm a Civil War guy, not a Rev War guy, just so you know.
All right, so that's where it started. And of course, there was some great historical reenacting of that recently in Massachusetts. That was the evening of the 18th of April in 1775, which then brings us to the Shooting War, which started in, of all places, Lexington, and with all people, a church group. Right? The militia was made up largely of a pastor's congregation, and a pastor led that day, didn't he?
Yeah, Captain John Parker was the leader of that militia. And for clarification, they were not the Minutemen. The Minutemen was a separate and distinct group. But they were the militia. There were 77 of them that gathered on Lexington Green. And most of them were related to each other. A lot of the similar names throughout that entire group.
So they came out and decided they were going to start a war.
No.
And, you know, the British came up and they ambushed them and knocked them out, right? That's the story of Lexington Green.
No, not at
all. A little different story.
Yeah. So, you know, the colonists in Massachusetts were a rebellious lot. They didn't like the tax on tea. And so you had the Boston Tea Party. And the British Parliament and the King decided to punish the people of Massachusetts. And so they basically stripped them of their rights, got rid of their government. They governed Great Britain from the royal crown in Great Britain. And so the colonists didn't like that much, and they got wind of the fact that the British Army regulars who were being quartered in Boston were going to come out and raid and confiscate their weapons, which they legally owned as free Englishmen. They had these muskets and cannons and ammunition. You needed this stuff because of the threat of Indian attacks and so forth.
And wildlife and that sort of stuff.
And wildlife, yeah. Maybe you don't need a cannon to defend yourself against wildlife, but you do need a cannon if you're defending yourself against Indian tribes that don't like you much or against out-of-control government. And so they had these things legally, and the British were going to march out and confiscate it or destroy it if they couldn't bring it back into Boston.
And this was at the Armory in Concord, right?
That's right. They knew that the stuff was being hidden in various homes and other barns and places throughout Concord. And along the way, they had to go through the town of Lexington. So from Boston, where they were stationed, the outskirts of Boston, to Lexington and then Concord, was about a march of about 16 miles, which is the limit of a well-trained infantryman. An infantryman, normally with a full pack and everything, will travel anywhere from 12 to 15 miles. That's really the extreme of what they're expected to do.
So they got to Lexington Green and they met opposition, but the church folk that were out there and the citizens and the militia were really making a stand of resistance. They wanted the British to understand that this was not just going to be a walk in the park, that they have rights too, and they're going to stand there and resist. So it was a protest, a resistance. They were clearly outnumbered, right? I mean, there was
Yeah, you had about 700 British regulars, and you had 77 militiamen, and the militiamen were not preparing to fight. Now they had muskets that with cartridges and musket balls and so forth, but they were not expecting to fight. This was at crack of dawn. It was early in the morning, like 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, and they did not want to shoot anybody. And the British were not expecting a fight either. And so they were playing sort of a game of chicken there on the Lexington Green, and the British, started forming ranks. And the Captain John Parker told his men to let the British go around you. Just let them march on by. There's plenty of room here. We're not blocking their way. Let them go on. We are simply demonstrating that we are free men with guns, and you can't take our guns. And we exist, but we mean you no harm. And the British, for their part, they were not trying to go out there and pick a fight either. But things spiral out of control, as they so often do.
And there's always been a great amount of controversy and conflict about who fired the first shot, but somebody fired a first shot.
Yeah.
And, it goes back and forth, and depending on how you view it. But the point is, once one shot was fired, then a lot of shots were fired.
Yeah.
Did any British people die that day on the Green?
Not in Lexington. One British soldier was partially wounded. He was in a minor way on his thigh. 7, I believe, or 8 Americans were killed. One was actually bayoneted. So the British formed ranks. Some of their officers came out and said, throw your weapons down, disarm, disarm. And the American Captain John Parker, when he saw that the British were fixing bayonets, ordered his men to disband. The problem with John Parker is that he had just gotten over tuberculosis, and so nobody could really hear him shouting out the commands. And between the British shouting their commands, the Americans, probably hurling insults back at the British, the beat of the drums of the British musicians and so forth, nobody could really hear anybody. It was a real cacophony. And so the shot rang out, and then the British fired a volley, and several Americans dropped. And then the British charged with bayonets and actually ran one American through and killed him. And the rest of the Americans scattered. And the British reformed ranks and said, all right, we're just going to keep marching, and they marched on to Concord.
It was a rather inglorious start for a war if you're on the American side. And it seems to be not even a fair fight, even remote, given the 10-1 outnumbering and the professional soldiers, the training, et cetera. It's a very odd way to begin to change the world. There's many stories and lots of moralizing that goes up out of this, but what's interesting is that the people who stood there were willing to stand there for what they believed in, willing to be fired upon. Now, they weren't willing to be slaughtered in a protest statement. So once this was understood to be a real battle, the only logical thing for them to do was retreat, and they did, but not for very long.
Yeah.
Because the word got from Lexington to Concord quicker than the British could get there.
Yeah.
And when they got to Concord, they were met by something that began to also change the world. And that wasn't just resistance, but the method of resistance. The Americans showed up to defend their gunpowder and their weapons, and the British were intent on taking them. And as the story goes, the British then suffered a significant amount of casualties as the Americans came at them from behind the rocks and the trees, so to speak.
Yeah, so the British marched on, and of course they're in a column. So some of the men got to Concord faster than the other men at the rear of the column. And as they got there towards mid-morning, then they broke up into companies looking for the weapons that they were trying to find. Well, by this time, some 400 Americans had assembled the militias and Minutemen. And the British actually took the bridge, the Old North Bridge at Concord. They actually marched across the bridge and said, we should take this just in case. And the Americans just kept coming out of the woodwork. Nobody was shooting. Again, it was a game of chicken. Nobody wanted to shoot. It was Captain John Parker at Lexington who said, do not fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Well, they had the same attitude a few miles away in Concord. But the British realized they were vastly outnumbered at this point in this sector. And so they retreated across the bridge, and the Americans were following them. Again, there's sort of like a Mexican standoff where they're facing each other, nobody's shooting. Remember, the British have bayonets. These are they have Brown Bess muskets, which can be fitted with a bayonet. So they are good at close order drill. You don't want to get too close to the British Army. They will skewer you. The Americans are using hunting pieces. So there's no bayonet lug. They can't fight with bayonets. They don't have a military weapon. But still they can shoot, and they were good shots. And eventually, again, as they're facing off against each other, another shot rang out. Nobody knows who did this. And this has been examined back and forth, back and forth. Again, nobody knows who did this. And then it was on. And the British and the Americans were just peppering each other with musket balls at a pace of about 50 yards. Can you imagine? You're only 50 yards away from each other and going at it. That's pretty close. And the British start retreating. And before long, it turned into a rout. And more Americans were gathering from all over the countryside. Eventually, the Americans had close to 4,000 armed citizens. And the British, including their relief column, which was coming out of Boston to kind of bolster their forces, the British only had about 1,700. The idea that the Americans were hiding behind trees and rocks all the time, that's not exactly true. It is somewhat true, but the Americans did form ranks just like the British did, and they would try to flank them and fire by volley in ranks, which was the standard way of shooting back in those days. By the time the British finally dragged themselves back into Boston, they had lost something like 250 men, many killed, many wounded, many missing. I don't have the exact facts and figures, but it was a clear defeat for the British regulars. And then they were hemmed in Boston, and the Americans just besieged the British Army in Boston for the next several months.
So who was Jonas Clark? Well, Jonas Clark is the pastor who was on the field that day in Lexington. Mm. And while it was John Parker who was in command, it was Jonas Clark that sort of was the ringleader of bringing those folks together. Now, some people allege that it was a pastor who fired the first shot. I just think that's way over the top as far as what we know for real evidence.
Sounds good to me.
But the point is significant is that you had a pastor as a key player in that first battle. And we know there were other pastors who came as well into that battle, people like John Peter Muhlenberg, mm-hmm. and who came to the aid of Washington's army and marched out. And so my point is that the American congregational life was very closely linked to the question of civil liberty. No church could escape it and say, that's not really what we do here. That's not really what we're about. If they were a church that was highly committed to the English form of both government and faith, they had a decision to make because it wasn't selling well in the culture. And they were going to be pushed to the edge in regards to American life. If it was a congregation that wasn't interested in the traditional English way of doing things, that had problems with the crown and the parliament as well as the church, then they were out on the battlefield. It wasn't a place like people were able to, tuck their robes and go hide in a religious experience. This was in everybody's front yard.
I've never understood why some of my fellow believers think that certain things are off limits to God, that certain subjects God is not concerned with. If a government is becoming abusive to its own citizens and is taking back the rights that the people naturally have and have enjoyed for centuries, as the American English colonists had been enjoying. Why should the church be silent on this? Now, I'm not a violent person. I'm not. I don't believe in shooting people. I don't like that idea. I think it's wrong. Unless there is an abusive government that will not listen to any other form of protest and is now coming to shoot me or to rob and plunder me. What other choice do I have? But the idea that God is not concerned about any of this, I've never understood that. So I'm glad that the pastors were there. They understood it, and they did what I think was the right thing to do.
Have you ever wondered how far reading can take a child? Could the love of discovery inspire a young life to climb to new heights? Meet William, a young boy who loved to read. He read every book in his house and then went looking for more. His story is a true story of how a young boy grew into one of America's most respected scholars, and it all began because he loved to read. The Front Steps is a true telling of how this young child overcame obstacles and barriers and kept climbing. Reading this story as a family will inspire young and old alike to celebrate the joy of reading and a love for history. Kids on the Square is delighted to present The Front Steps, an original work and a true story from the family life of William B. Allen. This is a children's book that every parent and grandparent should have for their kids and grandkids. You can order your copy today at thefrontstepsbook.com. 100% of the proceeds from The Front Steps go to help Kids on the Square help more families find the joy of reading. Get your copy of The Front Steps today at thefrontstepsbook.com.
Please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a special musical presentation from Nashville, Tennessee.
Well, I think it's also interesting if you talk to people who would generally support, for example, the Indian people who overthrew the British Raj, who did not want to be a part of British colonial rule.
Right.
The world supports and celebrates their ability to be free of British rule. Why not the Americans? You know, these people were born on American soil.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they have no real loyalty to the crown, many of these people, other than the fact that they knew that they were born to a colonial empire. So it's just interesting. You see people judge the American colonists differently than colonies around the world. British was a global empire at this time, and not everybody wanted to be a part of it.
And the Americans had been governing themselves for centuries.
Yeah, right from the very beginning, they had to get off the Mayflower and come up with a form of government, a civil compact. And it's been that way ever since. So this is the beginning. This is the beginning. Now, there were not a tremendous amount of battles between Lexington Green and the signing of the Declaration. It wasn't like there were hundreds of battles up and down the coast. This was the beginning, which then, of course, got all over the colonies. And to a large degree, it truly boomeranged on the Brits, because the focus, as you mentioned earlier, Jeff, of the War for Independence was in the Bay Colony. It was in Massachusetts. And Virginia was watching from a distance. Now, they were experiencing lots of different issues and questions in regards to the crown and taxation. And they were also dealing with the questions of religious liberty, because at this time, there was a strong discussion that the crown was also going to send designated government religious leaders to corral the colonies in their expressions of faith, and that there were new denominations springing up in the United States and things that were not in conforming with the way that England wanted to do church. So there was some of that going on as well that shouldn't be disregarded. But when there was blood in the streets, or blood on the square in this case, that word got on not just around Massachusetts and New England. That word got all across the 13 colonies at that stage. And so that's where you see the impetus for the Declaration of Independence, for representation in a Continental Congress, for the Articles of Confederation, for people to come together and say, okay, now we have a shooting war, and this is serious. It's either retreat and surrender or go forward. And the story of how the Declaration of Independence flowed from that moment is truly one of the most important stories in the history of humanity. In fact, historian Paul Johnson called it one of the greatest adventures in the human experience, how America came together. There's one critical item about the Declaration that we plan to be talking about around here for the next year or so, and we've been talking about it for 45 years, so I don't think we're going to stop. And that's the notion that the Declaration of Independence is built upon a key principle, several important principles, but one that leaps off the page is that civil government derives its just authority from the consent of the governed. Now, that's something that was not necessarily in writing before that declaration. In a way, the British monarchy was sort of, maybe kind of, something that happened based on the consent of the governed, but it was a long stretch. What Americans were after is saying, we want a document that we can sign through our representatives that literally creates our form of government. In fact, the first place, about the only place you can go back to find a model for that is the ancient Hebrew Republic, where Moses came off the mountain with a proposal. Yes, they were 10 commandments. They were God's point of view in regards to the covenant, but the people weren't required to submit to that covenant. They had a choice.
Yep.
And if you study that period of time of revelation, the people went up the mountain, the people came down the mountain. Moses went up the mountain, Moses came down the mountain. They went back and forth multiple times. In fact, there's even a literal situation where they sat down and had a meal together up on the mountain to talk about this. It'd be trivial to say that God had lunch with them, but it was the sort of meeting where the leaders of Israel were together to say, is this something we're going to do? And when they walked off, they did have a representative form of government in a covenantal relationship based on divine authority and the manifestation of the Word of God. This is the theory posited and validated by Harvard professor Eric Nelson in his book, The Hebrew Republic. So it wasn't, you have to go that far back to find a model example of an organization, a government built on consent. So when that word leaps off the page, and that term leaps off the page of the Declaration of Independence 250 years ago, it wasn't a coincidence. It was epic. It was landmark. There had never been a government created in this fashion, not based on power or upon land or upon wealth or upon just brutal force. This was built upon an agreement. Of course, Europe laughed. What kind of army do they have? Make up all the consent you want. Yay, good for you. Like a bunch of teenagers. We're taking over the world. Yeah, have fun with that. So the first battle didn't look too good for us, right?
Yeah, and the first major engagement, well, then the second one was the Battle of Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill. And, the British Army went up and they got, shot down, and they went up a second charge and they got shot down, and they go up the third time. This time the Americans run out of ammo. Oops. So the British won that one by default and bayoneted a lot of Americans who were retreating, who didn't have bayonets to fight back with. And so, the Americans lost that battle, but at what price? It was a real Pyrrhic victory for the British. They realized these Americans are ticked and they will fight, and we've got a major fight on our hands. But they couldn't retreat. They had to go forward. Both sides had to go forward.
All things being considered, this war for independence took about 8 years before it was finally, the paperwork was signed and it was finished. Just as a matter of, you're not a Rev War guy, all that detail, but what's interesting is that what happened in Lexington was very spontaneous and a very organic situation. George Washington wasn't there.
No, and he wasn't there for Battle of Bunker Hill either. He was called later, before the Declaration of Independence was signed, of course.
And that's a really significant factor, though, because this is a citizen-initiated effort. This isn't even an organized military response from the colonies.
The army that existed outside of Boston, that the British were trying to dislodge, that army was just guys like you and me. They were not a professional army. Who in the world did they? They had families, they had bills they had to pay, they had farms, they had factories, all the, small, cottage industries. And yet they left all of that and said, this is more important. Well, we have to have a leader. We have to have someone who can lead us into battle and strategize. They looked all over. I don't know if they, put it out on Indeed or anything, for a job posting. But they found a guy in Virginia who was already well known. And he had been tested in battle. And everybody agreed.
Many times.
You want one guy who is full of integrity, who does not know the meaning of the word fear, who never wastes words and is not looking for the limelight. He's not looking for glory in battle. But he's the guy who, if you lose, he will still be there the next day to fight. And that's George Washington. That's your guy. That's the one you want. And he was.
And it was John Adams who would later become his vice president, Washington's vice president, who was the most articulate and forward of the people advancing the young man from Virginia who had served in the British Army. And because he was a colonial, was unable to advance past the rank of colonel and lead on his own. And in spite of his service and his risk in warfare and being shot at multiple times and surviving in battle under fire, he recognized that he was a second-class citizen. And that sort of was one of the key things that sort of lit the fuse on George Washington deciding. Now, if you think about this, he was a ranking officer in working for the British Army, and he switched sides. And it wasn't for a paycheck, because like in his service for the presidency, Washington would only work for expenses. He would not accept a salary. And I can assure you that there were plenty of expenses that ended up in his pocket and never got presented with receipts. It wasn't because he was necessarily a wealthy person, but it was because, like everyone else, he realized unless we did the right thing as a nation, what he had wouldn't have mattered anyhow, because somebody else would have taken it away.
And now, a TPS bonus presentation from the Grammy Award-winning musical director of Christmas in America, Mr. Jeff Taylor. From his private studio just outside of Nashville, here's Jeff with a moment of hope.